If you'd like to skip straight ahead to the final interview that I conducted with Steve Albini, that's totally understandable. If you look at the notes for this show, I've included a timestamp that'll take you right to that chat with Steve. This is a very strange circumstance, as I did this interview with Steve, and then he passed away. And I wanted to share that conversation with you all, because for me, as I was pondering what to do in terms of a tribute to Steve, I wanted to say something. But we did spend almost 2 hours together on a Tuesday in April, and ostensibly to talk about the new Shellac album that's coming out. As I'm speaking to you in just a matter of days. And, I wanted to, honor that time that Steve gave me that day and share the interview. And so that's what you're going to hear. But I wanted to, and by the way, I've left every word almost in place. So if you're already sad about Steve's passing, then note that we talk about future plans and things like that, and it was hard to make a decision even about what to do with this thing, but I thought people would want to hear it. Anyway, this was longer than I do. I have some things I want to say about Steve and the long association we've had together. As someone, he granted me interviewer requests for a long time. And I want to talk about that and my admiration for him. So I'm going to say something for a while, and then you'll hear the interview. Or like I say, you can skip ahead. It's your choice. And I just wanted to say that before I start this remembrance of Steve Albini. In these parasocial times, one can fool themselves into thinking they're closer to someone they admire than they really are. In my work, there are numerous examples of me interacting with people I deeply, deeply look up to as mentors or leaders, and the initial encounters go well enough that we meet again, and again, and then again, and then again some more. There can be email and text threads between us, sometimes about our sort of working roles, sometimes about basketball games and back pain remedies and Norm Macdonald bits and hey, I found a used Ludwig Black Beauty snare drum through some kind of estate sale, but they only want a quarter of what it's worth and it looks completely untouched. Can you please take a look at this listing and let me know if you think it's legit? You do think it's legit? Okay, I'm going to drive 4 hours to Windsor from Guelph just to buy the greatest snare drum in the world for basically nothing. Thank you for the advice, Steve. Steve Albini died suddenly on May 7th, 2024. At the very least, he was a friend of the pod, as they like to say, appearing on at least one episode a year since this show began in 2013. Mostly for talks about his own music and work with the Letters to Santa charity initiative each December, but also to talk about his work with bands like Silkworm and Metz. He was also on an appreciation I did for Alan Vega from Suicide. But I think, and I'm not exactly sure except through people telling me that he spoke warmly of me to them at recording sessions and events, or he'd refer me to them for media things, or suggested his own friends like Fred Armisen be on the show and talk to me. I think that Steve and I were friends. I certainly feel as though I've lost one of my closest friends. I can't imagine feeling any more loss about a friend than I have since the news broke that Steve died last week of a heart attack at the age of 61 in his home, not far from Electrical Audio, the state-of-the-art recording studio he and his friends built in Chicago, where he lived for most of his life. It's also where he worked. Steve is someone I had heard more about before I actually heard his voice or his own music. I was 15 years old when I first heard In Utero by Nirvana, the band I liked. And I still have a sense memory of how the drumstick count-in that kicks off the album sounded special. It sounded different. The sound of it was different than any sound I'd ever heard. And then the song itself, Serve the Servants, kicks off and it has the impact of a fucking tidal wave. It sounded like Nirvana themselves were playing inside of the boombox that I had placed in the bathroom at my parents' house. Just a pure immediacy of sound I wasn't prepared for then, and still astounds me within all of the amazing rock records and other kinds of records that Steve made as a recording engineer. Around that time, I read more and more about him via Nirvana stuff and also punk zines and other kinds of outlets. I just heard lots of stories. A few years later, I played drums in a punk band that also used a drum machine at the same time. At our first show in Guelph, Ontario, the summer before I moved there to go to the University of Guelph, the sound person at the show, Steve Clarkson, said, "That was really cool. You guys sound like Big Black." Oh, right. That's Steve Albini's band. I'm going to see what Steve Clarkson meant by that. A couple of years later, I saw Shellac play for the first time. Not their first show, my first time seeing them. I'd borrowed At Action Park, their album, first album, on CD from someone. Maybe my friend Phil Hunter, or possibly my other friend Aaron Riches, but I think it was Phil. So I knew that record and I liked the band. But the first time I saw them live was happenstance in a way. I became aware that Fugazi, who I loved, were playing in Chicago on May 8th, 1998, and after I casually said we should all go down there, more than a few of my friends said, yes, we should actually do that. So I looked into getting us tickets and I ordered them. I was exchanging confirmation emails with someone named Heather Winna. The other bands on the bill that night at the Independent Rock Music Label Festival at the Congress Theater in Chicago were Blonde Redhead and Shellac. The show was unbelievable. Through Aaron Riches' friend, Ian MacKaye, we were invited to see all three bands play again the next night at the State Theater in Detroit, Michigan. Before going for a walk outside, we wandered through the theater during the day and got to hear Shellac and Fugazi sound checking. I have a memory of Joe Lally looking right at me in the empty theater at one point. Just because, well, there was no one else to look at yet, I think. At one point during the actual show that night, Steve Albini said something like, "There's only two things in the world that I really love, and that's eating pussy and playing this song." And then Shellac played that song. I don't remember what song it was, but I took his word for it at the time. He seemed very sincere about his two loves that evening. Other than possibly passing, "Oh, excuse me, eh? I don't mean to be fumbling a boot backstage, eh?" I don't remember speaking with Steve in Detroit. We stood near each other watching Fugazi, but I was mostly in motion, taking as many photos of the festivities as I could, as I had done in Chicago the night before as well. I don't know when exactly, but at some point in the sort of nascent days of the internet in the mid to late 1990s, I located a phone number for electrical audio. I idly said to my friend Jake, "I wonder if you can call them and just talk to Albini." Long distance charges being what they were, I went to the university's student newspaper office. The Ontarian was the name of the paper. I used to volunteer there and write. And I suggested to someone that I'd like to make a call to interview Steve Albini, and whoever was there said, "Oh, okay, sure." So I called the studio. "Hello, Electrical," a voice said, and it was Steve's. I think because I was both a bit startled it was him, and that there was just a tinge of this being a kind of a prank phone call or something. I kind of sputtered about for a bit, and if I recall correctly, asked him if we could schedule an interview or something, and he said with rightful suspicion, "Sure, just let me know when." And then I never called back. Shellac barely played Canada, but they did do a Western Canadian swing in the summer of 1999 with Silkworm. With the urging of my friend Jake, who wanted to visit our friend Ted in Vancouver, and because I was miserable, having been dumped by the same woman for like the third time in a year, I'm very loyal in my own way. Pathetic? Loyal? I don't know what the difference is sometimes. So I was not in a good state. And because I was working a boring summer job at my dad's office, I asked him, I need a break. I need a vacation from the summer vacation. And I thought, fuck it, I'm going to go see Shellac in at least Vancouver and Victoria, British Columbia. Before the Vancouver show, I saw Steve walking down the sidewalk in his coveralls. I'd brought the photos I took of Shellac in Detroit and Chicago to give to the band. Once inside the Starfish Room, which I recall being a nice venue that I believe was later obliterated by real estate development or something, I saw Steve again inside, and I approached him to give him the photos. Beyond seeing and liking his band Shellac, I don't recall having a very strong feeling about him at the time, just that I loved his band enough to fly across the country to see them. And I admired and agreed with many of his principles about things that were beautiful and worth celebrating, and other things that were pointless or evil bullshit. I think we were aligned in a lot of our thinking about both kinds of things. I guess I do remember thinking it was sort of magical he was there in person. In retrospect, he was always very famous and infamous in underground music, and certainly the Nirvana stuff made him more well-known than ever. And he was making a ton of important records of his own and by others in his job. So I said, I have these photos for you, Steve. And he said, oh, well, thank you. We don't really spend a lot of time looking at photos of ourselves. Plus, we're on the road, so keeping track of gifts can be tricky. But still, thank you. Gracious and practical. I appreciated this. Also, those photos I gave him mostly looked like dog shit. But maybe because I was headed to Vancouver, I thought I should pull a Nardwar and give this man some gifts so that I'd have an excuse to chat with him. The first time I formally interviewed Steve came 7 years later. By then, my now wife and I had started a weekly college radio program called the Mish Vish Interracial Morning Show on CFRU, the University of Guelph radio station. I was very upset when I saw the dates for the Touch and Go Records 25th anniversary party in Chicago, because they landed on the same weekend as that year's Guelph Jazz Festival in September 2006. I volunteered as a board member and a publicity coordinator for the Jazz Festival, and so I didn't see any way for me to miss that to go see Steve play in a one-off Big Black reunion, and also in a set with his band, one of my favorite bands, Shellac. But then my friend Evan was like, hey, we should go to the Touch and Go thing. Let's get tickets and drive down there. You know, if he hadn't said that, I would not have sheepishly asked my Guelph Jazz Festival colleagues if, since I had arranged most press stuff already in advance of the festival weekend, could I not be present at the Jazz Festival? Their begrudging, I guess it's okay if you did that, was enough for me. And so off we went to Chicago, and though it was raining a fair amount, as I remember, you know, as a glasses person, I can tell you it was super annoying. I had one of the best musical experiences of my life. And though while I credit Evan for taking the initiative and getting us there in the first place, to this day I also fault him and his buddy Graham for insisting we leave for home like early on Sunday. It was pouring rain, I guess, but I think we missed some cool shit. Anyway, sorry, before the festival, I had somehow reached out to Steve, see if we could do a radio interview that I could air ahead of the Touch and Go thing. And so we did. Sometime in late August, we scheduled a time to talk. It's a short encounter, but I just listened to it again, and I shared it on the Patreon there. And I think if we ever had an interview kind of spark when we were together, it's there. You can hear it a little bit already. That's my perception. I don't know what other people would think, but I resurrected it and shared it, and it was comforting to find that, to be honest. I mean, listening to it, I'm nervous and I'm tentative, and he's erudite and honest about everything, We take a few jabs at one another and we laugh about it. I mean, that was the start of something we do together quite often between 2006 and 2024. When Shellac finally played a Toronto show at the Horseshoe Tavern on September 16th, 2008, I was there, and it was one of the best shows I ever saw them play. I saw Shellac, I did a rough count, and I think I saw them maybe 8 times, 9 times, and that was one of the best shows I ever saw them play. Steve and I had done an interview that I used for both my college radio show and for a print piece I wrote in the Toronto Alt Weekly, which was called I Weekly. I'd emailed the band earlier in the day of the show, or possibly the day before, I don't remember, suggesting maybe we could go for dinner or meet up to say hi before they played, but I never got a reply. By this point, we had a rapport. It wasn't just me and Steve. I think Bob and I had a phone call, off-the-record phone call. I never really interacted with Todd, which is ironic because he's my drumming hero. I love Todd. He's my favorite drummer. So anyway, we knew each other enough that I felt comfortable just saying, hey, if you want to say hi. But like I say, I never got a reply to that email. So the show starts, and to start off their Toronto set, Steve Albini went up to the mic, and with this gleeful glint in his eye, he said, "Good evening, Guelph," which made some of the Toronto people laugh and some of them boo. That's Toronto in a nutshell for you, if I may. As for me, I was in shock. Did Steve say that for me? Like for me specifically? Why would he do that? Good evening, Guelph. Afterwards, I caught up with Bob Weston, and he was clearly content. They played a fantastic show, and he seemed really happy to see me. Years earlier, I'd asked Bob if Shellac might ever consider playing a show where I lived in Guelph, Ontario. And he told me, well, we'd likely play Guelph before we ever played Toronto because Guelph has a funnier name. I also saw Steve sort of side stage, and he apologized to me for not replying to my email about dinner because they were held up at the border and they really had to tear ass to get to the Toronto show in time. So they couldn't. I don't even know what they did for dinner, but he said he said they thought of me when they passed the sign for Guelph on the highway. And I said, man, thanks so much for the Guelph shout out tonight. That was really nice. It was really funny. And he said really kind of matter-of-factly, almost quietly, well, we knew you were out there. I don't know. It was honestly one of the most touching things that's ever happened to me. And fucking funny, too. Funny and touching. As I said earlier, since I started this Creative Control podcast in 2013, Steve appeared on the show at least once a year at my request. In his short lifetime, Steve participated in approximately... Hang on a second. I have a stat on this. I pulled up for this part of the... here it is. Yeah, it says it right here. In his lifetime, Steve Albini participated in roughly 33 million interviews. That's a lot. Somewhere between 15 and 20 of those 33 million interviews are ones he did with me. While I feel very special about this, I also know that I am not special. Steve said yes to pretty much everybody who asked him for help or his time, because I think for him, nobody was special, except that everybody was special. Everybody was equally special. Everybody who gave respect and was respectful deserved that in kind. For me, there are people like Steve and Ian MacKaye and a pretty long list of people, but I'll think of them as I'm speaking to you. I think they in particular would bristle at being called teachers or leaders. But beyond coming up with great riffs and turns of phrase and just being truly original people, like people who invented new ways and languages for humans to kind of express themselves, expressions, sounds, it cannot be lost to history that they also instilled empathy within young people through their words and actions. These are what my friend Michael Feuerstack would call true facts. And I know this from the personal experiences I had interviewing Steve over the last 20 years. When we were both in a good state, in a good place, Steve and I had a very nice rapport, and he was hands down the person I enjoyed interviewing the most. He was funny. He was super intelligent and articulate. He was critical. He stayed in the know. He always seemed to be up on everything from what I could tell. And he was generous with his time with me. He always made time for me. I am periodically asked about the 2-episode conversation I coordinated between Steve and Ian MacKaye in 2015, where I ostensibly moderated a conversation between them. Both had always been very accommodating to me in my individual interview requests, so I had a good feeling pitching them on this idea. I asked Steve first over email, and he thought it sounded awesome. And he was stoked because he hadn't spoken with Ian in a while. Ian got my email and asked if we could discuss it further on the phone, and once I explained it, he was also in. A little bit of inside baseball. This was the very first time I ever proposed a tape sync recording to my guests. What this means is, prior to this conversation, I'd get someone on the phone or Skype or FaceTime or whatever, and then I'd use whatever that sounded like to present to listeners. I generally sounded okay. I was talking into a good mic. Whatever they had going over on their ends, I would use somehow. But from my radio days, like working at the CBC and other experiences I had, I guess maybe at CFRU, although I don't think I did this there, I remembered something we used to call a double ender, which sounds sordid, I know, but it's basically that someone might be talking to you on a telephone, but they're also speaking into a microphone that records just their voice so that it's captured better than a staticky or distorted phone signal. So then they record their end, you record your end, then you mix their voice with your own well-recorded voice track, and voila, you sound like you're both in a recording studio together if all goes well. This is what I do all the time now, if possible. I don't know if you've noticed this, if you listen to the show regularly. I hope you have. It's a lot more work, and I think it sounds better. Anyway, I think me realizing this was a monumental meeting with two guys who did everything they possibly could to spend time in studios making sure records sounded their best, I think all of that compelled me to ask them if we could try a tape sync. Kind of a big risk in a weird way, because I don't think we had a safety net. There was no other way to capture what they were saying if their machines failed. But we did it, and if I recall correctly from like 9 years ago, I think it sounds quite good. So we'd scheduled an hour, but we wound up talking for 2, so I split it up over 2 episodes. Later on, Steve said he loved it and the format, and he even suggested other people I could contemplate getting together for such talks. It meant a lot to me that he enjoyed it. Steve meant a lot to me. He means a lot to me. I didn't always agree with his opinions. For example, I like Beastie Boys. Sometimes he said and did things that were objectively dumb and foolish, and that he later regretted, and he owned up to them. Occasionally, even on this show, he'd talk about things that he regretted. But he also had a kind of unfiltered honesty and ethical framework, and the courage of his convictions that some people perceived as, all sorts of fucking things that I don't really understand. We live in a culture that mocks people who try to be decent and true to themselves and work to better the lives of others in their communities and beyond. Because truth to power is a direct threat to complacency and the status quo of capitalism, which generally functions best if most people are suffering, or at the very least pretending they're fine, doing something they're really not fine with at all. And it leads to mockery of the people advocating for change, and it leads to people attacking them, trying to find their flaws and make their flaws bigger than anything good that they've done. I feel like that's where we live right now, and there's a whole host of reasons for that. And some of the lines of mockery that we hear a lot these days don't really make a lot of sense. Like, oh, this person thinks we should all agree to laws where we don't share the road with people who are drunk and high and they might kill someone minding their own business. You know, or wearing seatbelts could make cars safer so we don't go flying through car windshields and die. What a jackass for suggesting that. Oh, this guy thinks everyone should have access to affordable housing and healthcare. These idiots think tickets for events should be all ages and as affordable as possible for anyone who wants to attend. Who is this stupid scientist saying it's in our best interest to work together to avert a climate catastrophe or follow simple steps to avoid a pandemic that is killing or slowly killing all of us? And who on earth is this fucking guy in Chicago offering people a chance to make great records for a reasonable fee and who won't take their money again well after they've left the building? Seriously, who are these tedious, self-righteous dummies who could be completely selfish pirates, but are instead choosing to think of others and the long game in life instead of short-term personal gain? You hear this a lot now. And I think of people like Steve and Ian and others who quietly, in their own way, tried to blaze some trails to make things better and get harangued and hectored for their efforts. Instead of interrogating why the systems are failing, it becomes easier for some people to undercut the people trying to fix them with cynicism and doubt and look for holes in the armor that we've all put on them. If or when you point out the flaws in a system simply by working within it in a different manner, after they shoot you, they call you names. I think some people mock revolutionaries and visionaries not because of what they're saying and doing, but because of the change they represent. And people aren't just angry about a different future that people with wholly reasonable and logical ideas are working towards. They're angry about the past and present that they were fooled to trust and believe in. So they're angry. They feel like they were fooled. And who do they end up maligning or insulting? The messenger, the inadvertent person who can't help but be like, well, I told you this was going to happen. Their risk-taking and diligence can be confused for smugness, holier-than-thou righteousness. Why am I talking about this? I made a decision not to read any memorial pieces about Steve any mainstream ones. Because even quick skims demonstrated they all had some semblance of a man who altered music and culture forever. Could be a real dick sometimes. And he chose to never steal money from bands he could have claimed as his own, because the music industry is at least partly predicated on an unreasonable acceptance of motherfuckers being pirates and ripping other people off. And he foolishly chose not to. Anyway, that guy passed away. I didn't know Steve super well personally. I want to be clear on that. We spoke a lot, mostly using various telecommunication platforms and in person only a handful of times. Probably most substantively when Fucked Up invited me to attend sessions they had at Electrical Audio in 2013. That was with Bill Skibby at the helm, not Steve. So me and my friend Colin Medley went down there. We shot some film and did some journalism covering Fucked Up. We also talked to Steve. We filmed Steve making me a fluffy coffee and him updating me on the status of the yet-to-be-released Shellac album, Dude Incredible. Steve and I and others, including the engineer Greg Norman, I don't know, we were hanging out at Electrical. We watched TV together in the main room upstairs, and but we also did something at my behest, because there was something in the air and I wanted to clear it. We discussed my presence on the Electrical Audio message board, which we call the Premier Rock Forum, the PRF. Because there were some people on the board that were angry with me. They angrily viewed me as solely being there for self-promotional purposes for my radio show and my podcast interviews instead of, engaging with other board posts and topics and chiming in. Some were particularly angry with me because I tried to also dismiss and dispute what they were saying at the time. I was trying to suggest I was sharing interviews with people I thought our community might be interested in hearing from. I thought that was a worthy contribution, and I didn't really feel compelled to post much beyond that, and maybe I was also quite busy to do so. I just thought, here's the work I did. Hopefully this is interesting to people. But like I say, I think I know there were people who were angry with me there, and I will say I now believe the angry people were correct. It was a bit too much. Just listen to my show. It's not a way to conduct yourself. But at the time, I had another perspective on this, which again, maybe my show is the way I want to contribute conversation, and I don't have much more to say beyond that. And Steve, I remember we were in the TV room and he listened to me say, like, look, I can see it seeming self-aggrandizing if I was like, hey, listen to my hour-long monologue about my cats every week. That's my show. I just talk about my cats for an hour. I don't have guests, just me and my cats. But for me, I didn't do what I did and I think still do to really promote myself. I do it to provide a platform for creative people to discuss their work. I'm just a guy facilitating this and then trying to share it with as many like-minded people as possible. And I mean, yeah, I'm involved, obviously, but I almost see that as sort of immaterial, that it's about me. To me, it's about the guest. Anyway, I think Steve thought I was really full of shit that day. We didn't yell or anything, but he disagreed with me. And I did subsequently stop using that message board as much because I was far more comfortable promoting other people's work than I was taking up space by pontificating about whatever I thought about something, which I ironically viewed as being more self-promotional or self-aggrandizing than saying, hey, here, listen to this woman talk about her new punk rock book. You might find it interesting because you and I like some of the same stuff. Coupled with what he saw as a shoddy argument on my part, I think Steve also held a certain disdain for a specific type of self-important radio personality. And he wasn't sure at that point, I think, all of a sudden, if I was on that spectrum. This is possibly wild speculation and neuroses on my part, but it's a feeling I picked up on that maybe there was friction between us. Because when we first encountered each other outside of Electrical on that trip for the fucked up session, he and his wife, Heather, had just returned from the grocery store. And I think their actual house was under construction, so they were staying at Electrical. And I saw them lugging a bunch of groceries around. I said, do you need any help? And Steve looked at me and he said, no, we're fine. And as he was rummaging around the trunk of their PT Cruiser, Steve motioned to me and said to Heather, this is Vish from Canada. He's on the radio. And I swear to God, it felt like no designation could be more gross and belittling. Just the acidic derision dripping from that sentence. He's on the radio. He may as well have said, Vish here lives atop a mountain of goat shit. I laughed and I reflexively said something like, oh, I also do other things. I bring all this up because in my own neurotic way, despite our earlier warm encounters, I think Steve was briefly on the fence about me. That's my feeling. He knew I enjoyed Shellac and that I did some music journalism stuff and was supportive of him and his work. But I also think the PRF thing made him incredulous about me and maybe my objectives. I mean, for what it's worth, as I speak to you now, jobless, meagerly self-employed, I can assure you, I've never really had any objectives. You know how some people get a job and they think, one day, I'll be running this place. That's not me. I mean, that's happened to me before, but not from me chasing a goal. People occasionally think, you know what, you should be in charge. And I go, what are you, fucking nuts? I shouldn't be in charge at all. And then eventually, and sadly for my bank account, they come around to my way of thinking. Anyway, after a nice run of talks and interactions, I think it took a couple of years before Steve truly trusted me again. And then when he did, it was great. We would talk a lot for this show, and the time and generosity he exhibited towards me, and also the belief in what I was doing is something I value more than I can say. I also want to say, again, that all of what I just said, probably speculate, like just neurotic, insecure. He probably didn't think twice about me, but it's just a vibe. I just want to clarify. I'm sure he didn't think about me, because if I think about it, he was on the show 2013 on. He did whatever I think I thought I did. It wasn't enough for him to be like, I'm not talking to that fucking guy again. So anyway, back to what I was saying. Him being on the show and being a part of my life in some ways, a supportive part of my life, just, I can't tell you how much it meant to me. I never hit him up for too many connects, but when I did, he would always set me up. Steve, do you think Dave Grohl or PJ Harvey might want to speak with me? How can I connect with them? Oh, well, here's PJ's person. Ask her. Let me ask Dave about this. Then I get an email from Dave's person saying, Vish, I heard from Dave that Steve and your mutual friend Steve thinks you and Dave should talk. Let's set that up. Quick update here. This was never set up. Dave Grohl and I have never spoken. PJ was too busy the last time I looked into that. But Steve wanted to help me, and he did. When someone in the public eye dies, there are all sorts of speculative remembrances about who they were from people who knew them from afar, and these are usually mixed with those by people who knew them intimately through personal connection or work circumstances. Steve talked to and worked with so many more people than the average human being ever interacts with in their entire life. Like an impossible number of people were directly impacted by Steve. There are so many stories, and I'm sure some are the best stories and some were not the best stories. For me, as I've been grappling with Steve being gone, I felt like I'm looking at the world now without someone who shaped my worldview. I feel like one of the world's main characters has been killed off, and the show is just going forward without them, and it doesn't make any sense to me. I'm also thinking a lot about Norm Macdonald. One of my fondest bonding moments with Steve was when he was on the show and we got to talking about him playing poker with Norm Macdonald, who was the funniest person who ever lived. Norm was a comedian, so him being the funniest person who ever lived, it served him well in life. Steve said some really nice things about Norm on the show, and because I would exchange messages with Norm from time to time, I shared what Steve said with Norm. Well, by God, Norm wrote me back with the most flattering words about Steve's poker playing. And I screenshotted that and I sent it to Steve. I texted Steve, and Steve was so thrilled about that. He texted me with so much joy at seeing these words that Norm spoke so sweetly about him. And that really taught me a lot about Steve somehow, that he could be as excited a fan of Norm's as I was, as I am. Some days after Steve died, I thought of Norm's final appearance on The Late Show with David Letterman, where he did maybe the most perfect late-night talk show stand-up set I've ever seen. Letterman loved Norm so much that as he was winding down the show and saying goodbye to some favorite guests every week in the last year or so of the show, he'd had Norm on twice. He'd had Norm on once as a panel guest, so he was sitting at the desk, and Norm killed there too. I watch it often. It's one of the best panel appearances too. It makes me laugh so hard. Bob Uecker stories, all sorts of funny shit. But during one exchange at the desk, Norm said something that made Dave howl with laughter. Norm was expressing his sadness about Dave leaving, and he goes, I know you don't like emotions. You're like Nixon and shit. But when he came back to do that last appearance as the stand-up comedian he loved to be, and on a show whose host was an early hero of his, Norm broke down in tears. I know Mr. Letterman is not for the mawkish and he has no truck for the sentimental, Norm said. But if something is true, it's not sentimental, and I say in truth, I love you. And then Dave too kind of broke down, genuinely touched, but hiding it the best he could. I think of Steve too as someone who isn't or wasn't. I can't believe he's not here. I can't believe he's gone. I don't think Steve was sentimental, but also he was filled with very warm emotional depth and passion for the things and people he loved. But that warmth could turn into fire in the face of any evil he encountered. And beyond the art and the people we both had an affinity for, I think that's where we're most aligned as human beings, and that's why I and so many others like me feel so lost without him. Steve is known as a music person, but holy shit, was he an incredible communicator. He could write and talk circles around anybody. And if I think about it, well, what do I do? Yes, I've played drums since I was 15 or 16 years old, and at some point, every single band I've been in has at least one part I nicked from Shellac's Todd Trainer, hands down. And when I pick up guitars now, my go-to is to try to play Steve's particular kind of riffs in Shellac or Big Black. But if I'm anything right now, I'm primarily a communicator. I write and I talk about stuff, and I owe as much to Steve Albini for that as I do any music I play or love listening to. And it's not just those things either. It's how you get there ethically. Again, Steve was a great, innovative recording engineer, but for some of us, his trajectory's distinction is not only about the drum sound he got. It's about every single thoughtful and meticulous step he took with integrity and big love to get him to a place where he could get that drum sound and prove it was possible to get it by being a decent and kind and logical and thoughtful person. And then he shared what he learned with anyone who wanted to know more about it and experience that feeling of independent accomplishment for themselves. So it's more than a person we're missing. We're missing a leader in our collective consciousness as human beings. A genuine, charitable, unselfish, and encouraging force who is irreplaceable. Mr. Albini was not for the mawkish, and he had no truck for the sentimental, but if something is true, it is not sentimental, and I say in truth, I love you, Steve. You changed my life and nonchalantly challenged me and others to be the best people we could be. I will miss you forever, and I thank you for talking to me and really being a recurring character on this Creative Control podcast, which I really and sincerely can't imagine doing without you. In the low times of doing this work and wondering why I do, I've thought, well, you got to talk to Steve about letters to Santa in December. And now I don't got that anymore, so I don't know. Last interview I ever did with Steve took place at noon Mountain Time on Tuesday, April 23rd, 2024, my father's birthday. It was ostensibly about the new Shellac album, To All Trains, which at the time I hadn't heard a note of. We covered other stuff too. I feel fortunate that we did this so I can share it with you, but I'm also devastated that this is the last time Steve and I spoke. It feels weird to share a new conversation with someone after they've died, but I think people would want to hear it. And as I edited this conversation, I was laughing at him making me laugh on tape, and my wife walked by and I said, it's like he's alive. I forgot he was gone. So I want to share this with you for various reasons, mostly because I took up a lot of Steve's time that day, so damn it, I owe it to him to do something with this tape. Going to go to some messages I'm obligated to play before we get to the interview. And then you'll hear it. Please try to enjoy my final conversation with Steve Albini, whom I love and will always love. Thank you for listening to this, and thanks to Steve Albini for literally everything.
This is Dmitry Samarov from Chicago, Illinois, and I love listening to Vish Khanna's Creative Control because whether he's talking to a favorite musician or actor of mine or someone I've never heard of, it's as if he's introducing me to a new friend. And the way things are going, couldn't you use a new friend? Listen now.
To make your flexible monthly donation to Creative Control, please visit patreon.com/Creative Control today.
Thanks for listening to Creative Control. While I have you here, please consider supporting Youth Empowerment and Support Services, otherwise known as YES. Based in Edmonton, Alberta, YES provides immediate and low-barrier overnight and day shelter, temporary supportive housing, and individualized wraparound supports for young people aged 15 to 24. They work collaboratively within a network of care focused on the prevention of youth homelessness by providing youth with the necessary supports to stabilize their housing, improve their well-being, build life skills, connect with community, and avoid re-entry into homelessness. Learn more about how to donate or otherwise support YES by visiting yess.org. This episode of Creative Control is brought to you by some fine independent businesses, including Blackbird Music, a great record store with locations in Edmonton and Calgary, Alberta, which you can learn more about at blackbird.ca. Also want to thank Pizza Trocadero, The Bookshelf, and Planet Bean Coffee in Guelph, Ontario, and Granddad's Donuts in Hamilton, Ontario for their in-kind support for this show. And of course, everyone who subscribes to this show and supports it at patreon.com/creative control. Can't do this without all of you. So just want to take a moment to thank you all for all of your support. Hi, Steve. How's it going?
I'm going. Sure. Yeah.
That is the most unique answer I've ever heard to that question. That's good. I'm glad everything's yeah. Where in the world are you today?
I'm in Chicago, Illinois. I'm sitting in the isolation room of Studio A, which is colloquially known as Alcatraz, because it's there's an internal lore from the construction phase of the studio why this room got named Alcatraz. But I consider it's something of a sound prison where sound goes to die, you know.
I've heard of Alcatraz at Electrical Audio. I don't remember hearing tell of any lore. Do you want to share any of that? Or?
It's dumb. When we were building the studio, one of the first steps of the construction process was digging trenches in the basement for the footings of the walls that would eventually make the studio. And when you dig a trench around a little area, you create a little island. And so the smallest of these little islands got nicknamed Alcatraz. And then so, you know, like, oh, hey, where's the tool bucket? Oh, it's on Alcatraz. Where's the lunch order? Oh, it's on Alcatraz, right?
Got it.
So then the room above it got named Alcatraz just by association. Like this part of the building was always called Alcatraz.
I see. There are some interesting.
But I like the association of it being where sound goes to die. Life sentence for sound.
I have heard in recent months different and interesting stories about the construction of electrical audio. Greg Norman told the story on another podcast about a buzzing sound that was...
Oh, my God.
And then he had to track down where it came from. Do you know the story?
Yeah, there was a... I should preface this by saying we spent an extraordinary amount of money trying to isolate the studio from the rest of the city with respect to its electric power. For precisely this reason. When you're in a big city, there are a lot of sources of electromagnetic interference. You know, there's cell phone towers, there's broadcast terrestrial radio stations, there's low power radio stations, there are ham operators. There's all kinds of things and people that are generating strong electromagnetic fields. Sometimes there's industrial equipment like big electric furnaces and things like that put a lot of noise onto the power lines. And we isolated ourselves as much as we could from the city by creating we have an isolating transformer that isolates the electric power inside our building from the rest of the city, the rest of the distributed power in the city. We have our own ground stake for the building, which is a technical ground, a very low impedance ground that is a conductive pipe that's buried into the water table of the city of Chicago, and it was filled with conductive salts that dissolve into the earth and make the earth around the ground stake more conductive. So, and then all the ground pins in the building, like all of the outlets in the building, have individual ground wires that individually race down to the basement, and then connect to, like, there's a central ground bus bar for Studio A, there's one for Studio B, and then those are connected to this extremely low impedance ground stake under the building. So and the power inside the building is bipolar. It means there's a balancing transformer that balances the two legs of the power that come out of the outlets. It's a rather elaborate scheme, but what it does is, in theory, is it reduces the electromagnetic noise in the studio by a great deal. It makes individual pieces of equipment quieter. It makes amplifiers quieter. It makes the hum that your guitar pickups pick up quieter, all that sort of stuff. So you're operating from a background of near silence from an electromagnetic standpoint.
Huh.
We also put shielding around the rooms. Like this room I'm in right now has conductive shielding all the way around it, which is grounded to that very fancy ground plane. So we have a Faraday cage around this room to prevent interference from electromagnetic sources in the city. Anyway, in the early years of the studio, somehow, despite all of that, we ended up having a really brutal ratcheting interference noise that would show up during the day, during weekdays, like just during business hours. There would be this occasional ratcheting, like noise that would permeate the building, and it showed up on every amplifier. Not on the microphones and like studio specific equipment, but it would pick up through the guitar amplifiers of our clients and that sort of stuff. And it was just an extraordinary nuisance. And in the end, Greg Norman, after we hired a specialist, a guy named Neil Muncie, who flew down from Toronto, who's an EMF specialist, he came down from Toronto and spent the better part of a week here trying to diagnose the problem to no avail. We had Greg traipsing around the neighborhood with this wireless amplifier and a Stratocaster pickup on a fishing pole so that he could like swing it around in various places and try to find the source of this interference.
On a fishing pole.
Yeah, I mean, it was a broom handle, but we call it a fishing pole. At any rate, eventually we tracked down the source of this noise to a photocopier in the printing company next door to ours that had a faulty power supply that was apparently a known problem that had caused the recall of all of these photocopiers. But when they recalled all the photocopiers, rather than like get them out of circulation, what they did was they just sent everybody a free photocopier. So everybody now had a new problem-free photocopier that didn't cause noise for the rest of the world, plus a free one that they could keep using that would generate this harsh ratcheting noise and broadcast it throughout the neighborhood. Like literally from more than a mile away, you could still pick this noise up broadcasting through the air. It was an extreme example of terrible design and industry. Yeah. And many years later, I heard a story from Greg about his brother who worked in advertising, and his brother who worked in advertising was overseeing a voiceover at a studio, and there was this ratcheting noise through the speaker, and the engineer at the studio said, "Oh, give me a minute. I have to go shut off the photocopier." So apparently, like this ratcheting noise permeating recording studios was, a more ubiquitous problem than I thought it was at the time. But eventually we tracked it down. We convinced the people next door not to use that photocopier, and everything was great. We spent way too much trying to diagnose and resolve the problem. And the people who were causing the problem, like most people who cause problems, they're actually like they want to be cooperative. They want to be,
well, they're not trying to cause a problem. They were oblivious. Yeah, they were oblivious.
Yeah, they had no idea. They didn't know that they were ruining hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of sessions. Had no idea.
All that work you guys did that you were talking about, the shielding, the electrical, whatever. Is that something you learned from other studios, or is that?
Yeah, I had been in enough studios where there were big problems that could have been rectified by proper power distribution or by better grounding or whatever. Like I had worked in studios where there was just a persistent hum in the console that would print on all of the records that they made, and they just sort of lived with it, rather than fixing it. And our operating philosophy at the studio has always been like, if we can identify a problem, we're going to resolve the problem one way or another. Yeah. Either if it's a piece of equipment that we can't use, then we can't use it. If it's a piece of equipment that needs to be fixed, then we'll fix it.
Yeah.
But we've always had that as our operating philosophy, is not to have traps laid in the studio, like not have the amplifier that will shock you if you plug the wrong guitar into it or whatever.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. And things are going well at Electrical these days? Everything else fine? No noises?
Quite busy. Yeah, there was since the start of the pandemic, there's been a kind of a gradual readjustment, realignment of the studio world. And more people are recording at home, and more projects are getting started in a kind of an informal way. And then when they start, when they get legs, they end up coming into a studio to do some portion of the project or whatever. A lot of people kind of rekindled their music interests because they had spare time during the pandemic. And so bands that had been dormant for years are kicking back up again and wanting to do records again. There's an interesting thing that I was fairly early on, where this is in the news now because Taylor Swift did this, but bands are re-recording some of their more famous material because it is marketable for licensing purposes. And we just did an entire album for a band who had a modest success in the 90s, and they're starting to get a lot of interest in, because the 90s nostalgia is in full flight now. They're starting to get a lot of interest in their older material, and they wanted to have a version of their record that was entirely theirs. And I had done a record like that. I had done a version of Cheap Tricks in color, which is a magnificent album to start with. But they redid the entire album here from scratch in the 90s and have made really terrific use of it since then for all of these purposes that I'm describing, where basically whenever you hear a Cheap Trick recording in the wild, like in a TV show or on the Rockstar video game or Guitar Hero or whatever, it's going to be one of these versions that they own exclusively, and that they get to keep all the money from, which is great, for a journeyman band to be able to create a new revenue stream for themselves from the material that they had done in their early days, I think is kind of an amazing development. And that's happening more. I say it's happening more. I can point to several other examples of it happening, which is, on one hand, it's kind of amazing that bands are being able to pull one over on these massive corporations who thought they had them all locked up. On the other hand, it's kind of cool that people are getting more granular in the in their involvement with their own careers. People are starting to realize that the fine print matters, and that in the same way that the fine print can hold you to account for something that you signed when you were a teenager, you can make use of the fine print to weasel out of it in some cases.
Yeah.
I avoid it by just never having any fine print. I never have to worry about that. I just don't. Anything with fine print, I just skip.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. You invoked 90s nostalgia there a moment ago, and you're talking about, I think, cultural nostalgia. But I was thinking about this just the other day. It's interesting you brought this up. Do you think there's actually a clamoring for that time for those of us who lived through it and came of age in it? Because I was thinking about it.
It's weird.
It's pre-9/11.
It's weird because I don't have those kind of associations with it. I was a grown-ass adult by the time the 90s came around. So I don't have any adolescent affection for the 90s. The 90s was just kind of, a residual period for me.
Yeah.
I don't recognize that as being a particularly special time, ooh, that's when Lollapalooza started. Yeah. So I hated Lollapalooza then. I hate it now.
So that's cultural. That's cultural, though. I guess what I'm talking about, as we're speaking, everyone, it's 2024. There are genocides going on. There's wars going on. There's economic disparities never been worse. Racism, political strife, everything's fucked. And I'm starting to wonder if it's not just, hey, I like Friends, so I have 90s nostalgia. For some of us, it's that seemed like the last. Again, I started to say it earlier. That's also pre-9/11. 2001 hadn't happened yet, and so I wonder. And this is a longer conversation, but you brought up 90s nostalgia, and I think it just means different things for some of us now. It might have been a more comfortable time for some of us who were privileged enough to grow up in comfort. But do you think there's something to that? It's not just artifacts.
I mean, I think it's purely chronological. In the 70s, there was 50s nostalgia.
Yeah.
In the 80s, there was a psychedelic revival, and you know the Beatles were bigger in the 80s and 90s than they ever were in the 60s in terms of like their value as a commodity, right?
Yeah.
Then, you know, it's just every 10 years you get another 10 years further down the pike for the nostalgia thing, and there are like little whispers of this nostalgia to start with, and then it becomes like a big cultural entity, and then it's sort of trailing off, and you see like that nostalgia as being gauche and being like old-fashioned, whereas this current nostalgia that I'm in right now, that's the real one. That's the one that's really cool, you know?
Well, for some of us, it's nostalgia. For younger people who weren't around, it's like, I missed out on that. Like you were referring to people in the 70s clamoring for the 50s, and that's happened. You're right. Every 20 years, that seems to happen. But I think it's for some people, I'm astonished by the people who weren't even involved in it. That's not nostalgia. That's like, I missed out on something. And I mean,
the audience for Happy Days and Sha Na Na was not 70-year-olds. The audience for Happy Days and Sha Na Na was teenagers that were right. Like sort of looking at a different version of a coming of age that, you know, because of its oddity, it sort of tweaked some curiosity on their part.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I just don't think the 90s are different enough from now, or the 2000s. They're not different enough from now. Everybody had cell phones, you know, like everybody, you know, there was the internet already in the 2000s. Like that, it's hard for those things to like spark the kind of curiosity that earlier iterations of nostalgia did. What's kind of amazing is that there are these things sort of Ouroboros style kind of eat themselves, and you end up having like people who are nostalgic for a prior nostalgia.
Yeah.
And, you know, like sooner or later there will be a revival of interest in steampunk culture, which was itself a kind of a revitalization of if you remember when like films and books were kind of idealizing the Victorian era, then the steampunk thing was kind of an adaptation of that nostalgia. And sooner or later there is going to be a revived interest in steampunks as an outdated curiosity rather than them expressing outdated curiosity in the outdated or whatever.
Yeah, I just wonder if a lot of this stuff like is based on the fact that people aren't as happy with what's happening now, and they're looking for an escape route, so they conjure up something from the past, even if they didn't experience it.
Yeah, I mean that's always been a rationale for nostalgia. I'm not a nostalgic person myself. I think it's a cheap way to interface with the world.
Yeah. To
like take all this received wisdom and all of these conclusions that were made before, you know, they're pre-approved conclusions and, you know, results that I'm a poker player, and there's a principle in gambling is that you should not be concerned with the results. You should be concerned, you know, with your decision making and with your rationale for doing things. And nostalgia seems very much results oriented. Like, oh yeah, you know, we had this tumultuous period. Things were resolved, and these are the lessons we learned. And so I'm just going to, you know, take all of that as received wisdom, and then consider myself enlightened about it. And I think all of that stuff is dangerous, and I don't indulge in it. I think you have to be aware of the motivations of the people that were doing those things, and not just aware of them, but you have to recognize that you're subject to those same motivations. Like, I'm not a especially enlightened person, and I have to grapple with my own mistakes to the extent I'm capable. And I just feel like if you look at the past and what you see is the best version of yourself and the world, then you're capitulating all the decisions that you make today, and you're basically infantilizing your relationship with the present day. Yeah. You're saying that I just give up on the present day, and I'm just going to pine for when things were simpler for me and easier for me.
I think there's probably some comfort in the fact that the things people are nostalgic for often have closure. They're already done. I mean, there's no...
that's the results that I'm talking about.
Yeah, exactly. The story's done. Whereas if you're in a period of uncertainty and you don't know what's coming next, you seek refuge in something that's done. And the director or the band is done. Nothing else can be said. It's done. So maybe that's part of it too. I'm not sure how we started talking about this. This might be my fault. I'm sorry. It's just something I thought of as you said, 90s nostalgia. We are here today to talk about something very exciting. Most bands, when they put out a new record, they're excited. They can't wait. Some probably are feeling relieved. And I wonder if that is if that feeling is present for you, because over the years, we've talked about this Shellac album. When's it coming out? Yeah. What's going on? And the last time you were on with Fred, by the way, thanks again for connecting you, me, and Fred for that chat in December. That was fun. But yeah, you told the long story there about what was going on. Do you feel equally excited as you do relieved that the album is finally coming out?
I have always, and our band has always had a kind of an ambivalent relationship with things like the release date of a record. Like, it's never particularly concerned us when our records come out. We don't make a big deal out of it. We don't do any promotional stuff about the release of the record. We don't beat the drum about, pay attention, it's coming soon kind of bullshit. That's just a game that we don't play. Yeah. Like, we go about our business. We make a record. When it's ready, it'll show up in the stores. If you're interested, you'll probably find out about it. Yeah. If you're not interested, there's probably a good reason for you not to be interested in it. And we're not going to try to change your mind. Like it's like all of these things. If you don't participate in this kind of capitalist notion of product, where we're making a new product and we're trying to whip up some excitement among our target audience or whatever, if you don't participate in those things, everything just resolves itself. Like, yeah, it took us 10 years to get this record in the stores. So fucking what? Like, in another 10 years, no one will remember that it took 10 years.
Sure.
They'll either like the record or they won't. They'll either have it or not have it. And none of that stuff fucking matters at all. Like, I don't remember the release date of any of my favorite. Can you give me the release date of your absolute favorite all-time album? Like,
11th F by Bob Dylan came out on September 11th, 2001.
Yeah, that's a novelty. That's a curiosity. That's the only reason you know that.
I'm just telling you. No, listen, I understand that's external marketplace stuff. As the person in the band, as the person who's been like, what the fuck? How come this can't get done? Do you have that sense of relief?
I have to say, because of that attitude that I described, it was less stressful on me than it would have been on someone whose livelihood depended on their record coming out on time to hit the spring break rush or whatever the fuck it is, like, we got to get this out before Christmas, I can understand somebody having anxiety about that kind of thing. Yeah. I mean, for us, it was just a kind of a series, kind of a Three Stooges kind of a scenario of like, oh, that went wrong too, huh? And after a while, you're just kind of deadened by it. Like, we finished, the record was set to be finished in the spring of 2020. Like, we had a tour that we were undergoing. At the conclusion of that tour, we had some studio time booked. We were going to finish this little tour. Then when we were in great playing shape from having been on tour, we were going to hustle our ass into the studio and knock out the remaining songs. And then the record would be done, get the cover artwork together, and we'll have a record out in short order after that. Then the beginning of the pandemic started. It interrupted that tour. We postponed everything, put the band on ice, put the studio on ice. Everything shut down for a while. We had rescheduled, we had a tour scheduled for that fall, for the fall of 2020, which we rescheduled a year later. We just called everybody and said, hey, let's do it in another year. And everybody was like, fine with it. Like, great. We're glad to have something on the books for a year from now. That's great. Then a year later, when it came time to do that tour, the Delta variant was in full flight, and it wasn't safe to fucking tour again. It was like it hadn't gotten safe yet. So we canceled that tour, but we still had all the time in our schedules reserved for this tour. So we said, well, all right, if we can do it safely, let's go into the studio and finish the record during that period that we would otherwise have been touring. Let's just use that time productively somehow. So in the fall of 2021, when we would otherwise have been on tour, we came into the studio and we finished all the recording and mixing of the record. So then there was a gradual process of getting the artwork together, and we had committed to using this new pressing plant and a new pressing technology, which is environmentally better and had shown very good promise for fidelity. Like in the sample records that we'd been given, it seemed like it would be a step up in sound quality and efficiency and things like that. It seemed like there were a lot of things. This new process had a lot of things going for it. As it came down to actually getting clean test pressings from this new process, we found more and more very specific problems with it that this technology was just not mature enough to have resolved. And so we were sort of part of the R&D team that resolved these problems and found out how you had to address these problems. And I guess the temperature cycle needs to be like this in order to avoid this one artifact that we can hear. We had the luxury of having Bob Weston, our bass player, owns a mastering studio, so he could do successively more careful cuts of the lacquer to avoid some of the problems that we had been noticing on the test pressings. And also that builds a knowledge base. Like when you're using this process, you need to take a couple of small precautions in the lacquer when you're cutting the lacquer to make sure that you don't create these manufacturing problems. So it was a developmental process. It was informative. It was, and you feel like you're making progress, even if it means you get another round of bad test pressings. There is progress made in the technology. There's progress made in the application of this new way of making vinyl records, or making records anyway.
Yeah.
So there was some small satisfactions gleaned along the way, but the net effect of it was that it took us for fucking ever to get the record ready, you know?
Yeah.
And like I said, it's a process, and I try not to care about when the record is out, you know?
Sure.
When we were hassling with certain small printing details, for example, at one point I texted Bob, let's just put it out in a jewel bag. The Jewels is a local chain of supermarkets in Chicago.
Okay.
Your Jewels.
Okay.
And so I was like, fuck having a cover at all. Let's just put it on a fucking jewel bag. But all of that was, and in the end, like I've held physical copies of the record in my hand, and I could not be happier with the way the record came out.
Nice.
This new pressing technology is magnificent. The records are incredibly clean, noise-free, beautiful fidelity. It's satisfying to know that they use less fossil fuel, that they are less environmentally destructive, that they're imminently recyclable. Every part of the process can use 100% recycled materials with no loss in quality.
Yeah.
All of those things are gratifying, right?
Yeah.
And also the record itself, like I could not be happier holding the record in my hand, looking at the picture. Bob took a magnificent photograph of Union Station in Chicago for the front cover of it. And there's an arch in the waiting room that is the corridor that goes to all the train platforms. And that arch says, "To all trains." And I love that arch. I love that waiting room. It's beautiful. And Bob's photo is fantastic. And then we used a printing process called a duotone, where the image is printed twice. It's printed with normal black ink on white stock, but under that there's a silver image that's printed for all the mid-range tones, like all the medium gray areas of the image are printed in metallic silver. So when you look at the the thing, when you're holding it in your hand, it has a slight iridescence to it, and it looks like really rich and really like it's engaging to look at. It's a fairly simple, straightforward architectural photograph, but when you're holding it and you're looking at it, it engages you more than just a plain photograph does. And so I could not be happier with the end result of all of this bullshit. Right? I'm
excited.
Proud of the record. Yeah. The record's a good record. If you're familiar with Shellac, it probably won't. There probably aren't going to be a lot of surprises on the record. Other than what you would expect to be surprised by on a typical Shellac record. Yeah. Like, it's another record in keeping with our tradition of making records that satisfy our peccadillos and don't really play into contemporary themes at all. Yeah. But it was a lot of nonsense and bullshit trying to resolve a bunch of tiny details that seemed to all go wrong one after the other. But in the end, I'm happy with the record. As I said, I've chosen not to care about when it comes out. Yeah. And so it's going to be in the stores eventually. Yeah. I want to say the middle of May. Yeah, that's my understanding. I ordered it. I think the release date is May 17th. I think that's there. Right. You go. Yeah. I think it's slightly embarrassing that you know that and I don't. I think there's an official release date. It speaks to what you were just saying, how you don't pay that much attention to that stuff. I think it makes complete sense, and I'm a fan, and I suppose a nerd. I remember dates, I suppose, yeah. But I want to ask you a quick question because you mentioned the title. And obviously, from what you just said, the album is named for the photograph on some level. Over time, sometimes an album title can take on some metaphorical significance, if you will. At this point, early in the process, does that title mean anything more to you than... No, I do love the fact that because it's just those three words, you can read the sentence in a lot of different ways. Yes. Like, it could be that I am addressing all of the trains. Like, I have something really important to tell all of the trains, this is the beginning of a memo that I'm on a group chat with all the trains, and I just, attention, all trains, I think that's kind of charming. But it could also be, like if there was a comma after the word all, it could be like, at the moment, there are some people who don't have access to trains, and that's a problem that we need to resolve. Everybody needs to be able to all trains. Everybody needs to be able to get at a train, I like that as well. Oh, that's lovely. Yeah, that's cool. I'm glad I asked that because I was like, maybe it's just a picture. That's what was said in the picture. But like I said, I think there's potential multi-layered meanings here. So that's cool. Before we talk more, like most things, the meaning is imbued ex post facto. But if you're not aware of that, then what's the point of using those words? Yeah, absolutely. Before we talk more about the record, we have been talking a little bit about process. And, this band is 30-odd years old now, and I wonder at this point if you see any distinguishing demarcation or evolution of how the band practices, writes, records music. Can you speak to that? We committed to some core principles very early, and those core principles being it's just going to be the three of us. Like, we don't need anything extra, right? Yeah. That we're only going to pursue music that we as a group like we're not there is a lot of political shenanigans in some bands where to keep the peace you let the drummer have a song or whatever, some bullshit like that. We've never operated that way. We've always had consensus as our sort of operating principle. If we don't agree on something, we don't do it. And if there's a reason to keep discussing it, and there's an example of that I can bring up in a minute. Yeah. If there's a reason to keep discussing it, then we'll keep discussing it. But we're not going to take an action. We're not going to do anything unless we agree about it. Yeah. And our songwriting is exactly the same way. Like we'll get started playing something because the three of us are into it, and it'll work its way toward a finished thing without anybody ever having to articulate a direction sometimes like you'll talk about what the inspiration of what you were doing is. Like, oh yeah, I had this idea. It was goofy. Like there's one song on the record. There's a song about scrappers on the new record. Scrappers are the itinerant scrap metal and other collectors, people who like. There's a tradition of these people in Chicago, of these trucks that go up and down the alleys of all the neighborhoods in Chicago, collecting saleable items, scrap metal, anything that's in the alley is kind of fair game for the scrappers.
Yeah.
And they're beloved. They're an institution, and they're beloved characters in Chicago. Like I know. Since we started doing this song, I would talk about scrappers in other places, like talk about my affection for scrappers and how I think it's really cool that these people have created a niche for themselves in, hostile circumstances in a lot of cases. Really ingenious people. And I've learned that the sort of ecological niche in the city is filled almost everywhere. In almost every part of the world, there is a class of people who does this kind of scavenging, and there's a name for those people almost everywhere. And in some places, that name has taken on kind of pejorative connotations, or it's been used actually as a racist slur in some places. And that kind of surprised me. But I appreciate that it's different elsewhere. And so, I mean, that's been kind of a fascinating thing, like talking about scrappers and the way scrappers function. And then, one of the things that I really admire about scrappers and scrapper culture is there's a kind of a standard scrapper vehicle is a pickup truck with sideboards added to it. And there are pictures of some of these scrapper trucks in the Shellac album, and they're absolutely sculptural. And the way these things, they're intensely overburdened, because you don't want to make too many trips, right? Because that's inefficient and wasteful. So they just get mounded like just impossibly high with appliances and bicycle parts and, pieces of fence and anything of value, anything that can be sold is piled up into these like moving sculptures that sort of roam around the city. And they're really, really impressive. And anyway, the sort of plot of that song is that a child sees her father come home from work unhappy yet again. And the child has fantasized that her father will just cast off this ridiculous job that makes him so unhappy and sell the car and buy a truck, and then the two of them can go on adventures and be scrappers, and how much better a life that would be for the two of them to be spending all their time together, going on these adventures, like spending all evening traveling around like pirates, like the kind of a fantastic child's notion of what it is, in the same way that like kids romanticize and fantasize about like being a train conductor, or like it's quite common for kids to like get really excited when they see the garbage truck come, because it's this big mechanical contraption that's going to chew up the garbage and all that kind of stuff. Right. Anyway, so it's on that sort of same sort of theme. This child has imagined an entire life for her and her father, as when he finally gets up the gumption to just cast off this job that he hates, and then how much better their lives would be if he was just brave enough to do that. Yeah. Completely ignoring the precarity of trying to make your life off of garbage, right? Yeah. Like, so the child really clearly doesn't have the same priorities that the rest of the world does, and is just picturing but can see just the beauty in it, right? Yeah. Just the adventure and the wonder in it, and not any of these things. And it hadn't occurred to me the kind of stigma that in some places is associated with that kind of a lifestyle. Like, that hadn't occurred to me at all. Right. but that does add in the same unintentional way that adds to the kind of pungency of the child's ignorance of the whole thing. Anyway, that's the text of the song and the notion of the song. But the song started with me trying to mimic a figure from a children's song that I had seen on YouTube that I thought was really charming. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but you have a kid, right?
I have two. I have two of them.
And so you may be familiar with this. Are you familiar with the Pulcino Pio song?
I don't think I am. I'll have to ask my daughter. Yeah.
Pulcino Pio, if you just Google that, is a singing chicken that introduces all of the animals to an audience of children by singing this song about how each of the sounds that each of the other animals makes. Like, this is what the turkey does. This is the sound the dog makes. This is the sound the cat makes. Anyway, incredibly charming and real earworm of a song. There's one little figure in that song that I was trying to mimic on the guitar and failing at. But in so doing, me trying to play the Pulcino Pio song on my guitar and failing, I came up with a riff that then became this song about scrappers and has nothing whatsoever to do with Pulcino Pio.
Right.
And yeah.
So you brought that to Bob and Todd? What was my question?
So it started with me trying to play the Pulcino Pio song and failing, and I came up with a guitar part that then fed into another part, which fed into another part, whatever. And I guess the edifying thing about that is none of this was intentional. Like, I didn't set out to write a song about scrappers and scrapping culture and a fictionalized, romanticized version of the scrapping lifestyle. Like, that wasn't on my mind. It was just that was all of that sort of plot line evolved as I realized that we had a song here and the song could be about something. And that was just a notion that, because we had been talking about scrappers within the band and sort of admiring scrapping trucks. And Bob had informally started a project of taking pictures of scrapper trucks just to memorialize them for himself.
Yeah. I want to go through the songs. I really appreciate that insight about scrappers. That sounds fascinating. Now I can't wait to hear the song. Speaking of which, I should
point out that while we were working on the song, I was super stoked that the song was coming together. I was really pleased. And Bob admitted that it was his least favorite Shellac song of all time. While we were working on it, he was really not into it. He eventually came around, but he was that stasis that I was talking about how we agree on something and we're going to do it because there's a consensus, or we don't agree on it and we're not going to do it. Very real possibility that song died on the vine just because it did not appeal. Like, I don't know if Bob was a little. Yeah, I don't know if I should have asked him to clarify his opinion, but he did not like that song to start with.
I reached out to Bob over email to see if he'd participate in a chat about the new Shellac record. I'd reached out to you about inviting Todd on. You seem to be they both deferred. I understand I've never had an on-the-record talk with Bob except for email. Todd talks to people sometimes. What do you make of that, though? Do you want to explain maybe why they didn't want to participate in this particular? If it's personal,
it's personal. They have a really strong anti-Canada bias. No, it's just. I mean, part of it is like I do a lot of these things. Like I do every podcast, and when I say every, wait a minute, podcast, I mean,
you're on every podcast? I didn't know that.
Every single one of them.
Oh,
like there might
God.
be one. There might be a metallurgy one that I've skipped or something, but like basically every podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I have taken to heart a kind of a mentality that Fred Armisen has sort of demonstrated the value of to me, which is you just try hard to agree. When people propose something, you try to agree.
Yeah.
Try to find a way to agree to do it. And for something like a podcast, like, can I ask you questions for a half an hour? Like, it's such a trivial thing for me to, like, I can find time to talk to some guy about, music or whatever, not a problem.
Yeah.
So I end up doing a lot of these. I end up like this week, this is, I think, the third interview that I've done this week.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily to do with like the temporal stuff. It's not like because there's a Shellac record coming out. It's just like I get a lot of people with time on their hands who want to do podcasts.
Yeah.
And they, and they know I'm a cheap date, and they know that
Listen, I love having you on. 11 years of this show, you've been on quite a bit. It's nothing to do with that. I just am curious. Like, it's nice that you're here, and I'm sure others are wondering too. Why wouldn't Todd and Bob want to talk about Shellac?
I mean, I cannot. The way the band functions is really it's a subtle interaction between the three of us, and like we understand it intuitively and implicitly. Like we can communicate with each other, and we can feel things out, and we can tell when things are going well and going poorly, and like we know when to drop a certain topic or when to bring something up again. Like it's all unspoken. It's all just it's an intuitive and unspoken thing between the three of us, and I am in the position of articulating my thoughts pretty regularly, so it's comfortable for me. But to put somebody else who's not in that frame of mind on the spot and say, explain yourself, like I can see how somebody would not want to do that.
Sure,
right?
no, and I understand it. People are self-conscious about all sorts of things. The sound of their voice. They don't want to come across saying something they regret. I get it all. I just was, because you brought it up that Bob's not here and you don't actually remember why he didn't like the song or maybe why he came around. That's all. I just wanted to ask. That's all. That's all there is to it. One other thing, and this is going to lead us into what I hope we'll get into now, which is the songs on this record that I haven't heard. So for those who don't know, when the last Shellac album came out, Dude Incredible, Steve and I got on one of these things and we talked about it, and I hadn't heard a note. Now, this is because Shellac, unlike most bands and artists, they don't send out advance copies of their music to anyone. And Steve, before I get into it, do you want to explain? I think I know why, but can you explain why that would be the case? Why you wouldn't want people to hear anyone to feel special about hearing the record before everyone else?
Okay, so the main thing is just that there is a kind of a procedural norm in the music scene or music business. I should say music business. It's not. Sure. Where when a record is coming out, there's a kind of hype generated around it. There's a publicity generated around it. There are people whose profession it is to manufacture interest in things like that. And it's not really a competition, but there's like this quiet association that people make. Like this person is allowed to hear the record early so that we can exploit their interest in generating publicity for the band and the record. Yeah. And that by itself bothers me. And all of that is taken as kind of standard within the music business, is that you're going to be playing people against each other to kind of create this idea that, we'll get better coverage if we can make it seem exclusive, and you're getting the only cover. No one else is gonna get a cover. So that kind of stuff, and all of it is artificial, and it's removed from the music and from the people involved. It's marketing, which is maybe my most hated thing on earth. Like fascism is up there, but marketing is right behind, anyway, we just don't want to participate in it. And like the simplest way around it for us is to just go about our business. Like we make a record. It takes as long as it takes. It ends up in the stores, and anybody who's interested can go get one. That's all there is to it. And on one level, it's flattering that people are interested in the music and want to write about it. Like that's that sort of signifies that, what you've done up until now has had an impact. And I guess that's cool. But it also, there's a way that puts you in the same milieu as all of these publicity whores, like the people who are really desperate for attention,
Yeah.
And we just, we just want to remain as apart from that as is practical.
I assume you can also distinguish between someone who is interested in your band and wants to share with others that you might have a new record out, and is coming to that from a place of with goodwill in their heart. I assume you
but I don't want to have to be a cop about that. Like, I don't want to have to vet your rationale. Like, and as far as I'm concerned, you could have malicious intent for wanting to have me on your podcast, and I'm fine with that. Right? It's your podcast. Yes. You get to rationalize it for yourself. Yeah. And it takes a whole lot of ego out of the equation. It takes a whole lot of this sort of, when you start indulging that stuff, it plays toward your vanity and your sense of self-importance and all of these things that are just really ugly and weak parts of your character. And I just don't want to, I feel like I'm probably vulnerable to those. Like, I could probably get big-headed if, in the right circumstances. Like, I could start to want to get my ass kissed more and all that kind of stuff. But and I guess, maybe it's defensive. Maybe part of it is I feel like an alcoholic who doesn't want to go to a cocktail party. You know? Like,
no, I appreciate all of it, and I hope I'm not putting you in a awkward position just by asking. I'm just curious. I take no offense. I'm excited about the exercise I hope we can go through, because we did this during Dude Incredible, where I asked you about the songs, having not heard anything. You told little stories about them. And as I recall, like, people at Touch and Go and others were like, this is amazing. Imagine getting the stories about a song before anyone's even heard it. It's kind of fascinating. So if you will indulge in this, we've already talked about Scrappers.
Happy to.
Okay, here we go. First of all, by the way, I just for the record, I don't think there's a grand point here to make, but this album is 10 songs, and what I'm seeing here, according to Touch and Go, 28 minutes and 8 seconds. That's got to be the shortest Shellac album. Is that a fact?
Good question. I'm not. I don't do the stats.
Yeah, I didn't. I should have come prepared, but I think that's true. Just
likely.
Yeah, that's just what happened. There's no rhyme or reason. Yeah, okay.
I mean, we have some songs that are long in the absurd, and we have some songs that are normal length, and then we have some songs that are in between absurd short and absurd long. Yeah,
fair enough. That's what I thought, and that's fine. Okay. Let's start with side A. There's the first song, I believe, is WSOD.
That's an abbreviation for the World Series of Dick Sucking.
Is that a sanctioned event? I didn't know that occurred.
No, it's actually an expression that my friend Andy Kaczynski who's another amateur poker player, a friend of mine, and he was in a band, and that band was working on a song or working toward an album, and one of the proposed titles was the World Series of Dick Sucking as a play on the World Series of Poker, as though dick sucking being a competitive event, right? Mm-hmm. And that you could be the world champion of it. When I heard that expression, I resolved to steal it for something because I thought it was a really great notion, but I heard it in a different context, different matter. I thought of it in a different context, that being that there is a competition of ass kissers, of like people who desperately want other people to know how much they would be willing to supplicate themselves. Is that the right word?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
What, or how they would be happily, how happily they would debase themselves on behalf of someone else, as though, like, that was the competition. The competition wasn't in, skill and quality of dick sucking, but it was in to see who could be the most eager ass licker, kind of.
I see. And
just as soon as I frame that notion, everyone can start picturing different people in different contexts. Like, oh, that guy would win for sure. Mm-hmm. That guy would win, the World Series of Dick Sucking with respect to Donald Trump, or with respect to some other celebrity, or with respect to some, groveling position of some in some place or another. But so then the song, the text of the song kind of plays with the idea of the awards, the physical awards that you're given for things. The opening line is, I aspired to bronze, but I'll settle for lead. And the idea there is like if there were worse medals in the Olympics than bronze, eventually, you'd get tin, copper, tin, aluminum, molybdenum, whatever.
Sure.
Eventually, you'd get to lead.
Right.
Like I'd be happy just with a lead showing on this one. Like I don't need to be on the podium. I'll settle for lead. No problem.
Vaguely scrapper related again. Metal scraps almost.
Oh God, no! I hadn't thought about that. Now I have to think about that. But then also, you can win an event outright and get a medal or a crown or a trophy or whatever. But also, there's this new layer now where they test everybody after the contest, and some people will have been found to have been like synthetically enhanced. And their medals or their awards will get taken away, and then they'll be awarded to somebody who wasn't on the day, who wasn't recognized on the day. So you can be awarded a medal after testing,
right?
And nobody knows you won. And then for the rest of your life, like if they look at the newsreels of who won the various medals, you're not going to be there. People just have to take your word for it,
Wow.
No, they disqualified everybody. Yeah.
All right. Well, it sounds like there's some universal dick sucking going on. It's not about any one particular person or milieu by the sounds of it. In terms of the sound, and by the way, to distinguish between songwriters, this sounds like it's your song. Correct me if I'm wrong, but also sonically,
to the extent that anything is any one of ours, like this idea was discussed obviously within the band, and then the text of the lyrics is pretty much always the responsibility of the person who has to sing them. So
that's what I was getting at. I thought that was the case. So I assume there are songs that you and Bob. Does Todd sing on the new album at all?
Trying to remember if there is a backing vocal, like a group vocal anywhere. I don't think there is. I don't think Todd sings on this record. That's a shame.
Yeah, so you and Bob singing lead at various times. Okay. All right, I appreciate that. Anything you want to say about the song sonically? Anything that might be of interest?
So there's a kind of a mayhem part at the end where I step on the percolator and the guitar kind of goes nuts. And at the end of it, I wanted to shout, "My ass is in a jackpot," which is an ejaculation that an umpire made when he was explaining to a baseball player. There was kind of a scrum of baseball players around this umpire, and he was trying to explain why he had to eject somebody for cause. And apparently the league had been coming down on umpires for not controlling behavior in the game and letting the players be at risk, putting each other at risk or whatever. Yeah. And he defended himself by saying, "My ass is in a jackpot here."
I don't know what that means.
I don't know that anybody knows what that means. And it was really only tangentially related to sporting and defensive behavior, given the notion of competing at being a sycophant, which is the notion of winning the World Series of dick sucking is if you're the best sycophant, right? Yeah. It's a guy kind of putting his behavior in someone else's hands. Like the only reason I was behaving this way was because somebody else kind of made me do it.
Got it. Okay.
And that's, you see, that's like such a universal thing. Like people just excusing their own behavior because of conditions, sort of belying your responsibility for your own behavior, That's just it's such a childish notion, but it's so universal. You see it everywhere.
Sorry, did you say you were going to yell it, implying you didn't?
Yeah, and I ended up not doing it. Okay. And I'm now that I've had this little conversation with you, I'm a little sad that I didn't shout "my ass is in a jackpot."
Maybe for the live show it can still work. We'll see what happens. I don't know. Okay, let's move on. "A Girl from Outside," I believe, is the next song. What can you tell us about that song?
That is a very straightforward song about karaoke night at your favorite bar.
I read that somewhere in the description of something, or maybe you did an interview, and I wondered, because the last time we talked with Fred, karaoke came up a lot when it came to lounge acts, I think it was. Was that why we talked about it?
Yeah, like at lounge acts, for example, they had a little sign up that said no high fives except on karaoke night.
Right.
Yeah, and there's a reference to the high fives in the song about karaoke, Girl from Outside. The particular context is when you're at your normal regular bar, but you see a whole bunch of people who seem to all know each other and relate to each other, but are not regulars at the bar. And then you realize, oh, it's karaoke night. These are just the people, the karaoke rounders. These are the people that like go to all the karaoke nights, you know.
Yeah.
And that was where that came from. And then in all of those instances, like the title of the song is, you just recognize some girl from outside as she goes up to sing, like somebody goes up to sing her song. It's like, oh, that's the girl from outside.
Right. I was hanging outside. Okay. Has your opinion about karaoke changed, evolved over the years?
I'm sort of fundamentally pro karaoke. I think like people finding an excuse to sing in front of their friends is great. I can't really say I'm into the sort of cutesy, like almost like furry kind of quality that like fans, that enthusiasts of karaoke create. I mean, any kind of community is good, so like I'm okay with it.
Yeah.
But I don't think I would ever like be a karaoke rounder or anything. From memory, I've only ever sung karaoke once, and I was bad at it, so I don't think I would ever do it again. But
what song?
I don't mind karaoke and I don't mind being in the bar when it's underway.
Yeah.
And sometimes it is absolutely magnificent.
Right.
Like I saw Tim Midyett do a rendition of "Hanging on the Telephone," the song made famous by Blondie.
Yeah.
And he did a rendition of it with a live karaoke band at a PRF event that was absolutely phenomenal.
Tim's he's a great singer. We talked about this the last time he was on the show to talk about his new album. I was just blown away. I'd forgotten just what a great singer he is.
Yeah, really distinctive, really unique, really fearless singing. Like doesn't care if it sounds kind of weird to other people.
Yeah.
Like he just goes for it. I really admire his approach to singing, using his voice in a unique way. I think that's great.
Yeah.
So I'm generally pro karaoke.
You say you sang karaoke once.
Yeah.
Do you remember what song it was?
So there was a PRF event with a live band that you would submit songs and they would learn those songs and then perform them as your backing band. And there was a long list of people. And the first time I went to the World Series of Poker, I did better than I expected to in an event. And so I was there for long enough that I missed the actual karaoke night. So, but I came back and while the PRF barbecue was still underway, and most of the backing band was still there, was there hanging out. So they said, "Hey, do you want to still do your song?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, fuck yeah!" So, and the song that I had chosen was Boz Scaggs' Lido Shuffle.
Oh,
which is a pretty demanding song, and they were great. My timing was off, and it wasn't that great. My performance was not great.
You've never done it with the screen and the machine.
No, I haven't. No.
Okay.
I did sing one song on a Lounge Acts karaoke night, and now I'm drawing a blank on what it was, but it was, it was sort of to try to be a good sport about it, and I was bad at it then as well.
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate that. Is there anything we want to say sonically about Girl from Outside? Did we cover that? I don't remember.
No. I'm a little weird about that as well. I feel like... I mean, I'm not good at the sort of wine tasting terms that people use to describe sound. Despite the fact that it's my profession is resolving sound stuff. Like I tend to devolve into purely technical constructions when I have to talk about sound.
Let's be clear. This is an odd exercise. I've only ever done this once before with you, so forgive me if as we go, anything comes to mind about something sonically, feel free. I won't ask again, but feel free. Feel free to say something. Okay. The next song, Chick New Wave.
Yeah.
Where does that come from?
We had within the band, we'd had this long series of conversations about how like all of our favorite punk rock and new wave stuff was like these really like among our most favorite stuff was just these like really frantic female bands that were sort of endemic in the early punk rock and new wave era, where you had all these bands like the Suburban Lawns or Kleenex, and in Chicago there's a band called Da who were really fantastic, really great early punk band. And we just, all of us really like the stuff that we liked the best had this kind of unhinged quality, and for some reason like a lot of female fronted punk bands had that quality that we really admired. And so we just wrote a song that was an appreciation. Bob and I had specific appreciations of what we liked about that era of female fronted punk bands.
Okay. The use of the word chick, is that ironic these days? I feel like I don't hear that anymore.
Yeah, it's dangerous, and it's a little loaded, but it just seemed like a quick shorthand, and I think I could see that bothering people, and it may be, on reflection, it may turn out to be one of those things that I regret. I don't know. For the moment.
Did you name the song?
For the moment, I'm okay with it.
Yeah. Did you name the song?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll just leave this lying here and see what happens. That's the best we can do.
There's a line in the song. There's a line in the song where it says, "All I care about is chick new wave," and that's like basically for a while there in the van. Whenever we would put music on, it would be all of these like female fronted punk bands. That's all we wanted to listen to.
Yeah.
And we were just kind of hung up on it for a while. Like that was like we get in these little conversational loops where we just talk about one subject over and over again, or we get deeper and deeper into one subject, or we like, and this was like an aesthetic thing. Like we were just really into that. And every now and again, like we would quote lines from songs at each other. Like, anyway, never mind.
Okay. We'll move on to tattoos. I don't have any tattoos. I mean, I always feel like a minority in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
But I'm one of the few people I know that doesn't have any tattoos. Where did the song Tattoos come from?
Well, I don't have any tattoos either. And I don't have anything against them. I've just never had an aspiration to get a tattoo. And it never, I haven't come across anything that I've thought was so great that I wanted it on me forever. Like that. I just haven't run into anything that good. But then the one idea I had that my brother-in-law is a tattoo artist, and I asked him, "Can you do a tattoo of you giving me a tattoo?" And that's the only idea I've come up with that I would consider doing, and I haven't. But I'm also chicken. The thing that's weird though is like I see other people who are like covered in scribbles, and I think it's cool as hell. Like I think it's really like I have this friend Marissa Paternoster. She's a guitar player. She was in the band Screaming Females. Mm-hmm. And she has like all of these weird little things scribbled on her that each one of them has like some very specific association. Like this person on this night, we did this one thing, and I've commemorated it by having a stick and poke on my arm about it, or on my, like, oh yeah, I remember that. That was a really great slice of pizza, and then there's a slice of pizza on there. I think that's amazing. Or like people who have like their dogs or their their friends memorialized on themselves. One of my favorite ones, the comedian Michael Lehrer, who had ALS, and he's dead now, but before he was diagnosed with ALS, he had his last night in Chicago. He was he was at the Second City, and he had his last performance at the Second City. And they did an improv set for him, specifically for him, after the show on his last night. And he had a tattoo artist come up on stage. And while he was improvising and doing physical comedy, this guy was like sort of like chasing him around, doing a drawing of a CTA Brown Line train on him, because the Brown Line station was the closest station to Second City, but it also goes into parts of the town that are less trendy and less hip.
Yeah.
So he had a brown line train tattooed on his shoulder while he was performing for his last night at Second City, and I thought that was pretty. There are a lot of things about Michael Lehrer that are incredible, and that was one of them. Yeah. He performed as his ALS got worse and worse, and his comedy got more personal and braver and more unrelenting. Like the worse he got physically, the more interesting his performances became. And in the end, he relocated to Oregon because they had an assisted suicide law there, and he ended his life on his own terms. After the last 5 years of his life were by far the most meaningful and productive, and I think that's that was a really incredible way to go out. But like one of the most memorable things about Michael is just how he's always had this idea of doing something for reasons that made internal sense to him, and not being terribly concerned about anybody else.
Sounds like a lovely fellow. I'm sorry, was he the inspiration for the song, or did we get to that?
No. Oh, okay. We just ended up on that. Oh, sorry. What the song tattoos? We were talking about tattoos in general.
Yes.
The song has nothing to do with that.
Sure.
That song is very specifically a song about the attitude that I observed in the early pandemic, where people just wanted to be told that it was okay to do the things that they wanted to do, without caring about whether or not it was actually okay to do it. Like they just wanted to be allowed to go back and to having their life the way they wanted it. And sort of as though the rules were the problem,
right? As
though the problem was like being asked not to congregate in large numbers. Like that was somehow worse than the idea that you could just be responsible for killing a bunch of people, from this purely selfish notion of wanting your life to be normal again, right?
Yeah.
And it was just this sort of displacement of anger or disappointment, and saying what was wrong was that we were being prevented from doing things, and not the reason that those preventions were necessary. That's it. And then and it's just like the cavalier attitudes that I saw from people, wanting to do group events, being offended at the idea that wearing a mask was of any value, like all of these things, the people that reacted against the protections that were put in place during the beginning of the pandemic, rather than harboring like a more community spirit of saying, well, this sucks, but we're going to get through it. We're all going to do this. We're going to cooperate and make sure that everybody's safe. It would be like, like the mistaken notion that punk rock was about disobeying for the sake of disobeying, rather than punk rock being about disobeying meaningless or ineffectual or bigoted rules. You disobey those rules because the rules are bad. You don't disobey them because disobeying is prima facie good.
Yes. There has to be some positive intent to the punk rock. I appreciate that. That sounds very intriguing, but I'm just trying to associate what you just said with the name of the song.
At the end of the song, it says, "We'll tattoo the names of the dead on their hands."
Oh, okay.
Basically, if it were possible to remind all of these people that their selfishness was responsible for extending the pandemic and widening the pandemic and killing a lot of people, the way that I would like to remind them of that would be by tattooing the name of the dead on their hands. So they would always be aware of all of the specific people who were dead because they wanted to go to the fucking bowling alley or whatever.
I see. I don't think people like that have any shame or any sense of hypocrisy.
Which is why tattooing them would be worth doing.
This is Right. Okay. I appreciate that. Okay. I appreciate that, and I can't wait to hear it. The next song on the list here is Wednesday. As Steve and I are speaking, it's Tuesday, but I'm a fan of Wednesday. What is that song all about?
The working title of that song was Hump Day. And the word hump appears in the text of the song.
Oh.
So the idea of the song is that you have a broken character, someone who's been through a life experience that was transformative in a terrible way. And the person going through that transformative life experience was different to everyone and around everyone and in their behavior and after going through the transformative experience. And ultimately, that transformative experience changes them to the extent that it makes this character take his own life.
Oh.
Yeah. There's a little bit of wordplay around the word hump that I quite like in that song. I don't know that it cheapens it to talk about it, but it's hump has 3 meanings, maybe 4.
Okay.
The bend in your back, the marital act, whether or not you plan to marry. For him, it meant to carry. And then that's when I think about I just like the way that word has a bunch of meanings that are completely unrelated to each other. Like humping a bag of groceries up the stairs has nothing to do with the physical act of love, as they say, and it has nothing to do with the bend in your back. And the working title of the song was Hump Day just because of the word hump, and then we changed it to Wednesday because it seemed less dumb.
I see. Okay, so it has nothing to do. It has nothing to do with Wednesdays. It has all to do with the hump aspect, the multi-meaning of hump. Okay, I think I got it. That sounds interesting as well. But now the next, we're on to side B here. Steve, how you doing? You need a break? Everything okay? Okay.
No, this is. I mean, this is more talking about music, about our music, than I think anyone outside of the band has ever requested of me.
Is that true?
Like we never talk about the music. We just talk in sort of general terms about stuff. This is talking granularly and very specifically about the music is kind of it's weird. I would have expected myself to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I would, if someone had asked me, what do you think about talking about your band's music for an hour? I would have thought, oh, that's going to make me feel really self-conscious and awkward. But yeah.
I guess it's a testament to me and my ability.
And your genius as an interlocutor. Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. Okay. We've talked at length about Scrappers already. Is there anything more you want to say about it as we get into side B?
No, it's good.
Okay. I appreciate it. No, it was a great explanation earlier, and I really can't wait to hear that song. Okay, here's one. Days Are Dogs. Huh.
That's just the beginning of a long bit of lyrics that I wrote about how time gets away from you and you don't get things done the way you intended to. And my rationale for that was that days are dogs. They're distracted by each other's assholes. And then it goes from there.
Okay. That's interesting in itself. So you got Wednesday, and now we got Days Are Dogs. Time, sort of.
There's a Days Are Dogs. The concluding bit of Days Are Dogs is about, I don't know if you recall, in the 70s, there was a disaster at a rock and roll concert in, I want to say, maybe Cincinnati. The band The Who had where a bunch of people were trampled to death.
Yeah.
And there's a line in there where it says, "Unlucky, you were cursed to have been born here first, between us and our desires.
Huh.
Shitty trinkets and diversions that barely make it worth crushing the life out of your chest."
Yikes.
So, like, going to see The Who, maybe not even worth killing somebody over. Like, if you...
Yeah.
And the poor son of a bitch that was in front of you, that fell down on the way for you to on the way into the stadium for you to see the Who. Just bad luck.
Yeah.
Just bad luck. You happen to be in front of me. You know.
Yeah. It seems to me there's a bit of a. I'm not surprised. I follow Shellac. I would say that sometimes things get a little bleak and dark, but I'm picking up on some stuff here.
I guess the idea behind that is that, like, a lot of the things that people do for gratification are either for some kind of aggrandizement, like they do these things because they want to think of themselves as someone who has done something.
Yeah.
Or they are incredibly petty, trivial, shitty little things that they want, that they just have a material desire for, or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, well, again, can't wait to hear that one, and consider your insights as I ponder that one. That sounds interesting. Okay, the next one, I don't know if I'm seeing double here. I think the song is called How I Wrote Elastic Man, Cock and Bull. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, well, where did that come from?
So Bob was writing this song, the lyrics to this song, and it evolved that the song was about the act of writing the song.
Oh.
So the song is about, and we've done other sort of self-referential things like that, but this one was very specifically, the song is about writing the song. And because of that self-referential nature, I immediately thought of the Fall song, How I Wrote Elastic Man, which is ostensibly about the act of creation, writing, but there's some debate about whether in the song whether he says Elastic Man or Plastic Man, but then he changed it to Elastic Man to avoid any legal complications.
Right.
Which then that becomes the answer to How I Wrote Elastic Man rather than Plastic Man.
Right.
So even that is like sort of self-referential, but because it was self-referential, it sort of brought that to mind. And then I thought it would be, if the explanation was how you wrote the song, how I Wrote Elastic Man, then you would be talking about how I wrote Elastic Man. And Bob
got it. Yeah.
was game and went along with it. It was my suggestion, but I'm fucking thrilled that he went along with it because I really like the way that plays. But the actual song makes reference to this experimental novel that he was reading at the time called The Cock and Bull, which that novel has a sort of a circular premise where you read part of the story and then you have to begin again because you now know something about the beginning of the story that you didn't know when you first encountered it.
Oh, wow.
So the author is sort of breaking the fourth wall periodically and saying, begin again. And so that appears in the song as well, like Bob instructs you to begin again with your comprehension of the song because he's explained something a little more about it by the time you get to that point in the song. Yeah, I'm very fond of that song. I love the concept of it, like writing a song about the act of writing that song itself rather than, I write the songs that make the whole world sing, like rather than being like about like music in general, but just having it be like this particular task I'm working on right now. Let me describe it to you in detail.
So it's a comical concept. Is the song itself somewhat funny?
I mean, I don't know. It wasn't. It's not a chuckle fest, if that's what you're asking.
Well, I mean, for those of us who follow
notions in it,
there are funny shellac songs, is what I'm saying. Yeah.
But I mean, it's for me. I'm just going through the song from beginning to end, and I see Bob's reference points, and I hear and the things that he makes reference to. Having sat in the basement with him, going over the song again and again and again, and working on the small details of the song, I'm certain that it means more to me and to us than it would to anybody, and I'm cool with that. That's, I don't think it's important necessarily that other people get it. So as you can tell by some of the digressions involved in our conversations here, I like what goes on inside the band to get us to the point that we're doing a song is not necessarily apparent,
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, next up here, Scabby the Rat.
That is a very straightforward appreciation of the inflatable protest rat Scabby the Rat that appears at labor actions, typically in protest of a non-union workforce being used to take over a job that could rightly and rationally have been done by a unionized workforce. Labor participation was at an all-time low. There have recently been some labor victories, like there are some auto plants in the South that have unionized for the first time, which is kind of exciting.
Yeah.
Scabby the Rat is the name of the giant inflatable rat that appears at these at strikes and other work stoppages and other union actions to draw attention to scab labor and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
There was a Twitter account for Scabby the Rat that would highlight various labor actions and stuff, and it was run by a guy named Rob Wormowski, who was a dear friend of mine. He died suddenly and unexpectedly of meningitis, very rapid onset illness, and he went home from work feeling a little weird on Friday, and he was dead Sunday morning. It was really brutal.
I'm sorry.
And his wife Maureen was deeply involved in Chicago city politics. She ran against a daily in Bridgeport, which is the stomping grounds, the home turf of the machine politicians, the Daley family.
Yeah.
And she came within a whisker of routing him, which would have been, cause for celebration all over the city. But anyway, Rob was just a supremely beautiful guy, really funny, really insightful, great musician. He was in a band called Sirs that I really admired. Prior to that, he was in a band called the Defoliants, and San Andreas Fault was an instrumental group of his. He was a beloved figure in Chicago. He'd, been around forever, and there was a memorial for him after he died. There was a memorial at the Metro that went on for hours and hours and hours, for like 8 or 9 hours of just bands playing in tribute to Rob Wormowski, playing his songs, bands that were sort of contemporaneous, reforming to play for friends and family and that sort of stuff. That was a really great, really touching event, and Rob's affiliation with Scabby the Rat makes it a little appearance in the song. That's all.
I see. Okay. So it's a tribute to him as well as...
It makes mention of him, and I'm very fond of his association with Scabby the Rat. Yeah.
Okay. All right, we're at the end of this new Shellac album, and this is a cheery sounding number. I Don't Fear Hell.
That's a pretty straightforward song about how, it's not a new idea. Like AC/DC said it well, hell ain't a bad place to be. Like, if you think about all the people who a judgmental society would have damned to hell over the years, like if you think about all those people. My friend John Novotny, who used to be studio manager here at Electrical Audio, somebody said, you go to hell, like at some point. And he said, yeah, it's not like I'm not going to know anybody. And that kind of stuck with me. And and that's what it boils down to, is if there's a hell, I'm not going to be lonely. I'm not going to want for friends and acquaintances. That's for sure. You
have a penchant for creating narrative voices in your songs. We've talked mostly from your perspective today, but there's characters here, would you say, on this album? Like people you've conjured?
Yeah. Every protagonist in every song is fictional to the extent that I don't claim ownership of those ideas, despite being the one that decided to put them out there.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I was just asking, when you say I don't fear hell and you tell the story you just told, it sounds like you relate to
I'm the character in the song, the protagonist of the song, has this perspective that given his choice, he might actually prefer hell. Yeah.
Well, this sounds awesome. I can't wait to hear this record. Thank you, Steve, for indulging me in this fairly strange exercise, but I think I always enjoy. I've enjoyed it the other time. I enjoyed the other time we did it, and this was fun too. I'll ask some what's next questions for you just to wrap up here. So yeah, in terms of the band, I feel like you have tour dates. I saw that was, I think, Todd on Facebook.
Yeah. Our normal sort of not very strenuous touring schedule continues apace. We have an annual spring tour that we've been doing for 20 years now, where we play the Primavera Sound Festivals in Barcelona and Porto, and we play other dates around and in between those shows. I'm very proud and fond of our affiliation with the Primavera Sound Festival. They've been such stalwart supporters of the band and they've done a lot to sort of civilize the festival experience for the patrons and the bands. And I really, they could easily have like sold out, taken the money, and the festival would have deteriorated into just another sort of corporatized monster. Yeah. And they haven't. They're committed to their ideas, and I think that's great. Very, very fond of that. So that's why we keep going back there. They keep asking us, and it keeps being an honorable, respectable festival, and so we keep saying yes. Then we have other dates in the fall. We're going to be playing on the East Coast in the fall. Mm-hmm. Yeah, our touring schedule is always quite modest. Like it's rare that we'll ever play more than 4 to 8 weeks in a given year of touring. Like that would be a big year for us. 8 weeks of touring would be a big year.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Since the album has been completed, have you been working on newer songs than the ones that appear on the album, I guess is a way to put it?
Yeah, there's always things percolating in the background, and like we started playing the songs on this album. Some of those have been in our live sets for 5 years, 6 years, 8 years. Yeah. Like, we've been playing some of these songs on stage for a very long time, and it's possible that people who have seen the band a lot would be familiar with the bulk of the album by now.
Yeah. So subsequent to what's on the album, is there stuff as well, like just stuff that didn't?
Yeah, we're always tootling around on stuff. There's always unfinished business from the last time that we got together, and then there's always, we're always coming up with new stuff. I don't have any kind of a projection about when there would be more recording or more records coming out, but we're operating at our normal glacial pace. I should say.
Fair enough. I think one of the things we've talked about as well in the Shellac world was a rarities comp, and you have said, well, we got to get this album out first before we even think about that thing. What's the status of that?
Oh God, no new status still.
Okay.
We're prepared to release an album of hard to find shellac stuff, but we haven't done it yet.
Okay. Nothing has changed since whenever we last talked about it. Okay. So I like to check in because I'm intrigued by that thing as well. All right. So if people want to learn more about shellac
just
on the internet,
the dorkiest guy at like wherever you normally hang out, find the biggest dork there.
Oh my God, I feel like you're subtweeting me right now. Hey, by the way, are you off the Twitter completely now?
Yeah, fuck Twitter. Twitter is a shithole right now. Like every now and again, somebody will send me a link to like, oh, check out this thing I found on Twitter, and I'll pop on to Twitter for like just even as long as it takes to scroll and find the thing the person has clued me in on. It's such an unpleasant experience now. Yeah. So many Nazis and so many bots, and it's just I've been off of Twitter for at least 6 months. I don't honestly remember when I gave it up, but I don't really. My social media interest has always been like below par. Like I was on Facebook for a while. Facebook got awful, so I closed my Facebook. I was on Twitter for a while. Twitter got awful, so I closed Twitter. There's a thing called Blue Sky now that I quite like. It's a very near analog to Twitter, and it has a lot of counterculture people, a lot of like freaks and weirdos and queers on it. And I like the atmosphere, and I like the environment there. I've never bothered with Instagram or TikTok or any of those. Yeah. So I'm fine to just like every now and again see something funny and be glad I saw it,
Okay, well, like I know where to link. I'll link to the Touch and Go stuff and whatever else. I'll figure that out. And people can find Steve at electricalaudio.com if they want to work with you?
That's the studio website, is electricalaudio.com. My Twitter handle, actually, I should check and see what my official Twitter handle is.
Electrical WSOP?
Not Twitter.
Oh,
not
sorry.
Twitter.
Oh, sorry.
My Blue Sky handle. Let me see what my Blue Sky handle is. It's electrical WSOP .bsky.social. There's a mouthful.
Yeah, I'll link to that so people can follow you on that thing, and we'll go from there. Now, normally, I'm not going to be able to do this. Normally, I go out on a song from the record we're talking about, but we can't do that in this case. I'd bet that you could find at least a few of those songs in live versions on the interwebs if you were dedicated and wanted to search for them. I bet you could find them. You don't mind
you
don't mind if we go out on a live version?
I don't care.
Okay.
It's your podcast, bud.
That's true. It is my podcast. Sometimes people have to remind me. Yeah. Which song? If I can search for a specific song that you
I don't care.
You care for one in particular? What did you said you liked?
I don't care.
How about you really like How I Wrote Elastic Man, Cock and Bull? Can I find that? Is that easy enough to find?
I have no idea.
Good Lord. Okay.
I'm going to guess we haven't played that one live that much, so I'm going to guess no. Okay. That'll be hard to find. I don't want to get in. I don't want to be a part of this.
I'm sorry, Steve. I like to involve the people at the end here because it gives me some insight as to where their mind's at. Let's just say that
what you should find. You should find Hammersmith Gorillas by the Third World War. There you go. Play that song on the way out.
I don't think I can do that. Are they here? Are they in the studio? Can you ask them if we have permission? I need some permission. I can't do this right off the top. Yeah. No, I'm asking you.
I'm a big fan.
Well, we gave him a little plug. You may hear a live version of a Shellac song right now from their new album, To All Trains, and we'll go with that. Steve, always a tremendous pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for partaking of this relatively odd assignment, and I can't wait to hear this album, and I hope you'll come to Edmonton or something with the band, or I can go see you or something. I don't know. Otherwise, best of luck in the future, and I hope we talk soon.
Well, thank you. That's very kind.